Welcome back to the Book Nook. So today are going to do a deep dive into something pretty interesting. It's kind of how all these big academic theories that we hear about play out, when they hit the real world, especially when there's
Yeah.
this disconnect between the ivory tower and, everyday consequences.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And you sent over Intellectuals and Society by Thomas Sowell.
Yeah.
And it seems like a pretty thought-provoking look at this very issue. So I guess what we're trying to do today is unpack some of Sowell's core arguments about, I guess, how intellectuals shape what we think and believe, and then what happens when these big ideas run smack into the brick wall of reality.
Right. Well, it's a fascinating set of sources you've pulled together. We have stuff about how the media works. We have stuff about law. We have stuff about war.
Yeah.
Even stuff about social engineering. Big stuff.
Yeah.
And we are going to look at how Sowell analyzes the role of intellectuals. And he's got a pretty
Right.
broad definition. It's not just people you see on TV.
Right.
It's any thinker whose ideas filter down and affect the thinking of lots of people.
Yeah.
Even if they haven't read Keynes or Marx themselves.
Right. Yeah, and a key part of his argument, it seems to me, is challenging that idea that intellectuals just inherently have some kind of superior wisdom, especially when you compare it to, the more practical kind of knowledge that everyday people have.
Right.
The getting your hands dirty kind of knowledge.
Exactly.
So let's unpack this. One of the first things that Sowell tackles is this idea of how much influence intellectuals have on public attitudes, even if the public isn't directly engaging with their, really dense work.
Yeah. Well, what Sowell argues is that this influence often works indirectly. I mean, think about Marx or Freud. Most people haven't read Das Kapital cover to cover.
Yeah.
But their ideas, get repackaged and spread around by other intellectuals,
Right.
writers, commentators, academics, and so on.
Yeah.
And this is how they end up shaping public discourse, how we understand economics or psychology.
Right.
In fact, Sowell quotes Trumpeter, who said that a lot of self-proclaimed Keynesians or Marxians haven't actually read those guys directly.
Oh.
It's the filtered version that
I
takes
guess
all.
intellectual telephone. Is it
Exactly.
going?
Yeah.
And Sowell points out, there's that great George Orwell quote. He says,
Yeah.
some ideas are so foolish that only an intellectual could believe them, for no ordinary man could be such a fool.
Right.
And that kind of sets the stage for, this indirect influence isn't always good.
Right.
He's saying sometimes these brilliant theories end up having some pretty bad real-world results.
And this raises the whole question of accountability.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Sowell trusts professions like engineering or finance, where there's clear external metrics for success or failure. Bridges either stand up or they fall down.
Right.
Businesses make money or they go bankrupt.
Right.
But with intellectuals, the judgment often happens within their own circle,
Right.
based on subjective things like how innovative or interesting an idea is.
Yeah.
It's not always connected to real-world effectiveness.
It's like an engineer can come up with the most beautifully elegant theory for a bridge, but if that bridge falls down when you build it, it's career over.
Right.
But with intellectuals, it's their reputations can be fine.
Exactly.
Even if their theories don't really pan out in practice.
He gives examples like Sartre, who remained a really influential intellectual, even though some of his ideas didn't necessarily square with the evidence.
Right.
Like Paul Ehrlich famously predicted mass famine in the 1970s.
Right.
That obviously didn't happen.
Right.
But he continued to get acclaim and funding.
Wow.
So for Sowell, this lack of a clear external test for intellectual ideas is a big problem.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the separation from real-world, verification, Sowell argues, that can lead intellectuals to undervalue what he called mundane knowledge.
Yes.
And that's the everyday practical stuff that people pick up just through their experience.
Right.
It's not really written down in books or academic papers.
He gives a great example.
Yeah.
Location for a business. You can have all these fancy economic models.
Right.
But the shop owner on the street knows where the foot traffic is.
Right.
That knowledge is often more important than the abstract stuff.
Yeah. That's a really good example.
And it's this kind of dispersed practical intelligence held by millions of people that intellectuals often overlook
Right.
because they're focused on these big theories and data sets.
And Sowell argues that this has led to some pretty big real-world
Right.
consequences,
Yeah.
especially with things like economic central planning.
Yes.
Like you have all these incredibly smart people.
Yeah.
They've got mountains of data,
Right.
sophisticated models. They're trying to plan an entire economy
Yeah.
from the top down. And history has shown that this approach just doesn't work as well
Right.
as a freer market where you've got millions of people
Yeah.
making their own decisions based on their own knowledge.
Look at what happened in China and India.
Yeah.
They both saw massive drops in poverty when they shifted away from central planning
Yeah.
and moved toward more market-oriented systems.
Right.
And it's not that they got like smarter leaders overnight.
Right.
It's that they tapped into the collective wisdom of their people.
That's a really good point. So it's like intellectuals kind of prioritizing their own like
Yeah.
specialized knowledge, but then dismissing the practical knowledge of
Yeah.
everyday people. And Sowell's saying that's a problem.
It often leads to bad policy.
Right. And it's not even just about ignoring this mundane knowledge. It's
Yeah.
like sometimes they actively dismiss firsthand experiences
Yeah.
that contradict their ideas, you know?
He uses the example of Theodore Roosevelt,
Yeah.
who, because he was a rancher, had direct experience with Native Americans
Right.
and came to certain conclusions about them. And a later biographer who didn't have that experience
Yeah.
just wrote him off as prejudiced without considering that maybe his views came from actual interaction.
It's interesting.
Hmm.
A more recent example is that Duke lacrosse case.
Oh, yes.
There was this huge rush to judgment in the media and among lots of intellectuals,
Yeah.
fueled by all these assumptions.
Yeah.
But the women on the lacrosse team,
Right.
the ones who actually knew the guys involved,
Right.
they were the first to defend them,
Yeah.
and they turned out to be right.
And what's interesting is how their firsthand accounts
Yeah,
were given less weight than this prevailing narrative.
right.
It shows how powerful these intellectual frameworks can be,
Yeah.
even when they're disconnected from reality.
It's like expertise can almost be used as like a political cover sometimes.
Yes.
You know, Sowell talks about how sometimes experts are brought in not to give objective analysis,
Right.
but to make decisions that have already been made
Mhm.
sound legitimate.
Exactly. The outcome is already decided.
Yeah.
And they just need an expert to give it a stamp of approval.
Right, right.
Sowell is really cautious about blindly trusting experts, especially
Yeah.
when they are operating outside their area of competence.
Right.
He uses the example of lawyers and judges acting as social engineers,
Right.
making pronouncements on complex social issues that go beyond their legal training.
Which brings us to another area Sowell looks at,
Yeah.
the role of law in society.
Yeah.
He argues that there's been this shift from seeing law as like a set of fixed rules
Right.
to seeing it as a tool for social change.
Exactly.
And judges are making more and more decisions that go beyond
Yeah.
established legal precedent and their expertise.
And this has led to some unintended consequences.
Yeah.
He points to the reversal of the long-term downward trend in
Mhm.
U.S. murder rates in the 1960s
Right.
after certain judicial decisions about criminal law.
Right.
Law enforcement professionals saw what was happening on the ground,
Yeah.
but their warnings were ignored
Right.
because intellectuals were focused on these abstract theories.
It shows how intellectual ideas, even in a field like law,
Yeah.
can have a real impact on people's lives, for
Absolutely.
better or for worse.
And this brings us to another key concept,
Yeah.
the zero-sum fallacy,
Yeah.
which Sowell says is a big problem in how intellectuals think about economics.
So what's that?
It's the idea that in any economic interaction, one person's gain has to come at another person's loss.
Right.
Sowell points out that voluntary economic transactions
Yeah.
have to benefit both sides, otherwise people wouldn't do them.
Right.
But intellectuals often focus on disparities in outcomes
Right.
and see them as inherently unfair or exploitative
Right.
without considering that both sides might be better off.
And he talks about this confusion between like statistical categories and actual individuals.
Yes.
You know, we hear about the gap between the rich and the poor.
Right.
But Sowell points out there's a lot of movement within those groups over time.
Exactly. It's not the same people in those categories year after year.
Right.
People move up and down.
Right.
And it's important to distinguish between income and wealth,
Right.
which are often lumped together.
And he also talks about how intellectuals often ignore the underlying costs and complexities in business and finance,
Right.
leading to these simplistic judgments about prices or interest rates.
He uses the example of short-term loans in poor neighborhoods.
Yeah.
The high interest rates might seem predatory,
Right.
but they often reflect the actual risks and costs of lending in those communities.
Right, right.
It's not as simple as it might seem at first glance.
And this all ties back to this claim
Yeah.
that capitalism just inherently creates poverty.
Right,
Sowell argues that these claims never compare capitalism to what came before,
right.
or explain why, if it were so bad, people would voluntarily participate. It's like
Right.
they are missing the bigger picture.
Right,
So we've been talking about these different ways of seeing the world.
yeah,
And Sowell contrasts what he calls systemic causation
yes.
with volitional causation.
Right.
Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. Systemic causation looks at how social outcomes emerge from the interaction of lots of people
Yeah.
and institutions, often without any central control.
Okay.
Think of like market forces.
Right.
Volitional causation focuses on intentional choices by individuals or groups,
Okay.
especially those seen as powerful.
Right.
Sowell says that intellectuals tend to favor the volitional view,
Right.
which leads them to believe in central planning
Right.
as a way to control the chaos of individual decisions.
So they're underestimating the order that can come from all these individual choices and
Yeah.
adjustments.
And this preference for top-down control
Right.
often leads to calls for more government intervention.
Right. Right.
Sowell argues that a lot of intellectuals don't really understand economics.
Yeah.
They see it as zero-sum.
Right.
So they think the government needs to step in to fix things.
Right.
But he gives lots of examples where government intervention has backfired,
Yeah.
like minimum wage laws leading to higher unemployment,
Right.
rent control making housing shortages worse,
Yeah.
the Smoot-Hawley tariffs deepening the Great Depression.
It's like they don't always think about unintended consequences.
Exactly.
So we keep coming back to these really different ways of understanding how society works.
Yep.
And Sowell talks about these two contrasting visions.
Yes.
The vision of the anointed and the tragic vision.
It's a brilliant framework.
Can you break those down for us?
So the vision of the anointed is held by intellectual elites
Okay.
who believe they have a superior ability to understand and solve social problems.
Okay.
They see themselves as enlightened,
Right.
and anyone who disagrees is either ignorant or immoral.
Right.
The traffic vision acknowledges human limitations
Okay.
and the fact that resources are scarce.
Okay.
It values experience, history, and caution
Right.
because it recognizes that even good intentions can have bad consequences.
So those two visions lead to very different approaches to policy.
Absolutely.
The anointed want big, sweeping solutions.
Yeah.
The tragic vision favors more cautious, incremental change.
Right.
And Sowell says that the anointed often dismiss opposing views without really engaging with them.
Exactly. They're so certain of their own righteousness
Right.
that they don't even bother to consider other perspectives.
And Sowell argues that this filtering of information and
Right.
dismissal of opposing views isn't just limited to intellectual circles.
Right.
It affects how the media and academia portray reality.
He gives lots of examples, like
Yeah.
the tendency to portray certain groups in a positive light.
Right. While demonizing others.
Exactly.
And they often amplify certain victim narratives
Yeah.
while downplaying information that might contradict those narratives. He even talks about how some hoaxes or exaggerated stories get a lot of attention
Yeah.
just because they fit a particular agenda.
Like those claims about widespread arson at black churches.
Right.
Or the flawed studies about starving American children.
And then there's the whole thing about creating simplified caricatures of historical figures
Yes.
like Herbert Hoover to fit a certain narrative.
It's all about the power of narrative.
Yeah.
These stories become so ingrained in people's minds
Right.
that it's hard to have a nuanced discussion based on facts.
It's like the language itself is being used to manipulate our perceptions.
He talks about verbal cleansing.
Yeah.
How words are changed to make things sound better.
Right, like changing bums to the homeless.
Exactly.
Or swamps to wetlands.
And this brings us to a really sobering topic,
Yeah.
intellectuals. And Sowell points out that intellectuals have a terrible track record
Right.
of supporting disastrous wars,
Yeah.
often based on abstract ideals,
Yeah.
without considering the real-world costs.
He talks about how lots of intellectuals were all for World War I.
Yeah,
With all that talk about making the world safe for democracy.
right.
But then the horrors of that war led to a big shift towards pacifism.
Right.
But Sowell says that this pacifism had its own dangers.
Yeah.
It created a kind of moral disarmament
Yeah.
in the face of rising threats like Nazi Germany.
Right.
Intellectuals downplayed these threats
Right.
and pushed for appeasement.
Right.
They underestimated the importance of national honor
Right.
and the willingness to fight for your values.
And Sowell suggests that this intellectual climate may have actually emboldened Hitler.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And we see similar patterns in more recent history
Yeah.
with intellectuals opposing the Vietnam War
Right.
and criticizing the surge in Iraq,
Right.
even though those strategies ultimately had some success.
It's like they prioritize these abstract ideals
Yeah.
like peace at any cost
Right.
over dealing with the realities of aggression and conflict. So we've talked about how intellectuals exert their influence
Right.
and some of the potential downsides.
Yeah. Now, Sowell also talks about the incentives and constraints that shape how intellectuals think and behave.
Right.
What are some of the key things he points to there?
Well, he argues that intellectuals are rewarded for coming up with new and impactful ideas.
Yeah.
They don't have the same kind of feedback loop as, say, a business owner
Right.
who either makes money or goes broke.
Right.
So their ideas can persist even if they are not practical or effective.
And because they're not really held accountable,
Yeah.
they can venture outside their areas of expertise without much consequence.
Exactly.
And he also points out that government officials, politicians, bureaucrats, judges,
Yeah.
they often amplify the influence of intellectuals
Right.
because they themselves are often operating outside their competence. So it's like a feedback loop where
Yes.
untested theories from academia can end up driving public policy.
It's a worrisome trend.
Finally, Sowell asks a really big question.
Yeah.
Have intellectuals as a group been a net positive for society?
It's a provocative question.
He suggests that intellectuals have often weakened traditional social bonds like
Yeah.
family, religion, and patriotism,
Right.
and push for new forms of social division
Yeah.
based on things like class or gender. By setting these unattainable standards for society,
Yeah.
they may actually be contributing to more conflict and resentment.
It's a sobering thought.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Thomas Sowell's ideas,
Yeah.
what stands out to you about the impact of these academic theories?
Well, it's clear from everything you've shared that Sowell is really concerned about the potential for these theories
Right.
to have negative unintended consequences when they are divorced from reality.
Right.
He's urging us to be critical of these ideas,
Yeah.
to value different kinds of knowledge,
Right.
and to be wary of solutions that sound good in theory
Right.
but might not work in practice.
It makes you think, whose knowledge are we valuing?
Exactly.
And how do we know if an idea is actually good? And it makes you think about how the way we talk about things
Yeah.
can really shape our understanding of them. It's like this constant tension between these big ideals
Yeah.
and the messy reality of how people actually behave. We've just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore about this relationship
right.
between intellectuals and society.
Where else do you see this dynamic at play?
Yeah, that's a great question for our listeners to ponder.
It's a conversation that needs to continue.
Absolutely.